Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here this evening on this lovely evening in Liverpool. I've got the pleasure of being joined by Mr. Laurence Westgaph, a good friend and an excellent historian. Just to provide some context before we begin the interview, if you don't know me, my name's Richard Grannon. This channel has been active since 2012, and it's been focused on narcissistic abuse, identifying narcissists, psychopaths, recovery from narcissistic abuse, PTSD, CPTSD, childhood trauma, and trying to break cycles of intergenerational trauma. For those of you who do know me, you might be thinking, if this is a channel about narcissistic abuse, why are we doing an interview on the history of slavery in Liverpool? And the answer to that is I think it's actually a perfect combination of subjects, because at the moment, with the way the world is going, I'm doing my best to become more historically literate. And I realized I'm pretty historically fucking ignorant on a lot of things. But it actually helps a lot to understand the way in which history tends to go in cycles. And what happens is there's the majority of people in all cultures, all nations, all the family units across the planet are quite reasonable. But it's not the majority of reasonable people that set the agenda. It's narcissists and psychopaths. And they lack empathy. They have no compassion. They don't care who they hurt. And in a sense, that's not even the threat. The threat is our complacency as the silent majority who sit back and think, number one, it's like a naive optimism. Oh, everything will be okay. Don't worry about it. No, it fucking won't. And if you know your history, as Laurence does, it doesn't work out that way. And the other thing is we hope somebody else will come along and fix this before it gets too bad. They won't. There's only us. There isn't anybody else. So a principle I teach in psychology for recovery is nobody's coming to save you. So if you're recovering, you're in charge of your recovery. In the political and the power sphere, we are the people. So if we just allow narcissists and psychopaths to determine the agenda of the direction we move in, all kinds of horrors can take place. So genocide, enslavement, torture, unimaginable cruelties can take place, whilst the silent majority of reasonable people are hoping that things will work out well. So I think it's very relevant to the subject. It's my hope, it's my naive optimism, that we can break the cycles of intergenerational trauma. And I naively and optimistically believe in the curative power of truth, which is normal for therapy. Therapy leads people to truth. In the psychoanalytic tradition, Freud and Adler and Jung taught us what we repress and what we suppress doesn't disappear. It comes back to haunt us. And I think what we're seeing now is like a broad scale shadow possession, because we just didn't tell the truth about our nation, about our family, about our culture. And it's making us really, really sick. And there's nothing to be scared of. The facts are the facts. You know, some of them are painful, some of them are horrifying, but that's the same if a family unit, if a terrible crime took place, if there was domestic violence, incest, child abuse. Yes, terrible things happen, but repressing doesn't help. So I believe if we can tell the truth, we can move forward in a positive way, integrate the shadow, and move from a survival state to a thriving state, because otherwise we risk tearing ourselves apart. Laurence, you thought you were coming in for a history interview. We're going to save humanity tonight. Is that the very history of humanity? The final part of the context here. I've known Laurence for nearly 23 years, mate. We first met when I was doing nightclub security on the Life Cafe. So those of you, the older heads, will know a bit of Liverpool history. Like, I've just dated us there, the Life Cafe, mate, back in the day. And I've recently reconnected with Laurence through his walking tours here in Liverpool. If you get a chance and you can come to Liverpool, it's an amazing, eye-opening experience to see how the history of slavery, the history of the slave economy, it's in everything, isn't it? It's in the food we eat, the clothes we wear, your socks. It's in the soap you use to wash yourself. It's in everything. And it's good to know. I found it really, really useful to know. So, Laurence, if you could tell these good people a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you do what you do, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So my name's Laurence Westgaph. I'm a Liverpool historian, just trying to finish off my PhD, as I've explained to Richie. It's proving difficult with all the COVID stuff.
Very brave. You've got evidence of that. I've coached people through PhDs and it drives me mad.
Absolutely. I'm there, mate. I'm absolutely there. I'm obviously a a Liverpool lad. My family have been in Liverpool for over 200 years. And I'm very interested in the history of the city and kind of how the city's developed because of that history. We're quite a unique city in the fact that we don't really have a long history in comparison to other places, but became very important very quickly. And that's really shaped the way, the identity of our city in a number of ways. You know how passionate Scousers are about our city and how we're, you know, militantly Scouse and militantly proud of that city. And I'm just really interested in investigating kind of where that comes from, being somebody who does have this long history of an association with the city. And so, you know, based on my own personal background, obviously I've looked at the history of the development of the town in light of the British Empire, which is really what was instrumental in Liverpool developing the way that it did. And that came, you know, that led me to look into our links to slavery and the slave trade. And not just how slavery and the slave trade shaped Liverpool and shaped our identity, but also how it helped to develop this particular part of the world in terms of, you know, Britain and the British Empire and, you know, the Industrial Revolution. And so that's really what I like to think that I can share somewhat authoritatively with yourself and your listeners, watchers.
That'd be awesome. What was interesting for me that I got from you, as I'm listening as a psychologist a little bit as well, is you're aware of everything that happened in this city, because it's often said there were no slaves here, or very few slaves here, which we'll get into in a moment. But it's evident that you are proud of the city, even with its history, because you know the depths of the darkness of the history. And it seemed as well like you're proud to be from Liverpool, you're proud to be a Scouser, but also proud to be British as well. So how does that fit? I mean, you know how bad it was here in Liverpool, but that doesn't affect the fact that you're proud of the city. How does that fit for you?
Well, because I wouldn't be the person that I was without the history of the city. I am a product of that, you know. As again, Liverpool, because we have this history of people coming here from elsewhere, you know, everybody's an immigrant. You know, the population of the city in the 1650 was 1,250 people. Right. So most people have come here from other places. So I very much associate myself or my ideas of self with my geographical location. Whether people in other places do the same, I don't know. But, you know, like I said, we have this very strong idea of what it means to be Scouse, or what it means to identify as a Scouser. And I hold my hands up and say I'm very much a product of my environment. Right. You know, I wouldn't be the person that I am. My genetic makeup would have been totally different if I'd been born elsewhere. And that's why I think that I probably am so fascinated with the history of the city and how it developed.
It's interesting. Steve was saying to me, Steve is one of the Spartan life coaches, some of you'll know. He was saying to me, well, his history in the city goes back to his grandparents, and it's the same for me. We're Irish. Your history goes back. You're way more Scouse than we are, you know, because it's 200 years. So is that, as far as we know, Liverpool is unique in England for that piece of history, isn't it? That there's been a black community here. It's 200 years.
300 years.
300 years.
Yeah, more than 300. Yeah.
So what established the community here initially? Well,
primarily Liverpool's connections with West Africa and the Caribbean. So Liverpool, as I said, it's a very small place in the 1650s. It's not until we capture Jamaica that Liverpool really begins to grow. So in 1655, Cromwell captures Jamaica from the Spanish, and then Liverpool's importance starts to grow in light of the West Indian trade. So that was the trade in goods that were produced over there, primarily by slaves. And then later on, when the Royal African Company loses its monopoly in 1698, Liverpool merchants get involved in the slave trade. And within 50 years, Liverpool dominates the trade. You know, and, you know, us Scousers, we like to think we do everything better than everyone else. And in terms of the British involvement in the slave trade, we certainly did.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, for me, again, coming back to identity, that's something that shapes the city as this maritime connection. You know, we all talk about how important the river was to Liverpool. You know, and that was primarily, certainly in the first period of our great growth, that was associated with both West Africa and the Americas.
So when I first started looking into this, it was 3 years ago. And I went to the museum here, and I was reading about it online, and I saw numerous times there were no slaves. There were no black slaves in Liverpool. And I've seen it even recently on your Facebook group. What do you say to that?
Well, it's just it's become part of the narrative of the city that's incorrect. And, right. You know, any good historian is looking for primary evidence to establish facts and truth, as you mentioned earlier on. So I spent a lot of time trawling through parish records and old newspapers. And as you know, because you've been on my walks, you know, I show you advertisements that show enslaved people being sold in the city of Liverpool. So, for example, one is on the 12th of September 1766 in the Williamson's Liverpool Advertiser at the Exchange Coffee House on Water Street. Everyone's probably familiar with Water Street. 11 Negroes were sold. And they'd been imported on a ship called the Angola. So I showed those advertisements. Lots of baptismal records show quite clearly black people, many of whom were enslaved, being baptized here, living and dying here and being buried here. Many of them not being even buried with their names, just referred to by their owner's name. So, for example, a black boy belonging to Captain Penny, or Mr. Fisher's black. These are the types of entries you see in the burial registers. So we know that there's been a black presence here continually from at least 1717 and right up until the present day. And that's what makes Liverpool so unique, is that we can actually, we can chart our 300 years of settlements. Because we're a much smaller city than, let's say, London, it's much easier for us to show those connections throughout time.
Right.
You know, so again, within my own family, you know, I've done that. Showing how my family came, well, they were certainly here by the 1820s, and one of them was a runaway slave who comes to Liverpool and has a family here, and I'm a descendant of his descendants.
What was his name?
His name was Robert Cox.
Right.
He was originally from Barbados, then he was sold to a Mr. Townsend in Jamaica, and then at some point there, when slavery was still, you know, going on, he was here in the 1820s. Slavery was not abolished until 1834. He comes to Liverpool and gets married here in 1822 at St. Peter's Church in Church Street.
Right.
And it's now gone, but that's why Church Street's called Church Street.
Right.
And at one stage, the family actually lived in this street where we are now, in Jordan Street.
In Jordan Street,
Yeah.
right,
This was, at one time, this area was known as Little Africa. Now it's known as the Baltic.
Yeah.
But this area was the area of the major black settlement after the 1790s. So this is where black people tended to live during that period. And he lived, one of his descendants lived on Jordan Street.
So not the black community, obviously there were slaves coming in and out, and then there was free
blacks and enslaved people here at the same time. The black presence in Liverpool during the 18th and 19th century was as socially stratified as the white community. So there was black people here who were on the lowest rungs of the social economic ladder, just like there were white people, and there were also black people who were on the highest rungs of the social economic ladder.
Right.
These would have been people who were the sons and daughters of rich merchants, many of whom were involved in the slave trade themselves, who had children with women of colour, as they were called, and brought those children back to Liverpool. Some of them were the sons and daughters of West African slave traders who were partners with the Liverpool slave traders, who sent their children to England in order to learn the business.
Right.
You know? So they'd come over here to find out what the price of fish was, basically to make sure that my dad wasn't getting ripped off back home, and they'd get an education here, learn how to speak English.
Yeah.
That would help to facilitate trade.
So there wouldn't have been black slave owners here, but there would have been families who were mixed families who would have been slave owners.
Yeah, totally. And there were black slave owners who were the sons of West African slave owners back in West Africa.
Living here in Liverpool.
Many of them lived with some of the most prominent families in the city. So we used to have a firm of solicitors here called Laces. Joshua Lace was the first president of the Liverpool Law Society, and he grew up in a house. His father was a man called Ambrose Lace, who was a slave ship captain, who then becomes a merchant. And he had his partner's son living in the house with them.
Right.
And letters go back. This was very sophisticated business. The letters going back to each other throughout their lifetimes, talking about, you know, how's the wife, and give young Joshua my love, and you know, next time you send the ship over, can you bring 6 looking glasses, 2 umbrellas, you know? And this was the types of conversations that they had. And one of his partners in West Africa sent his son to live, and he lived with Ambrose Lace in the house, and Joshua and him became friends.
Amazing.
So it's far more complex than we have. You know, we have this idea of like the roots idea.
Yeah.
It's much more complex than that.
So the roots idea, could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's just one particular narrative of a system that was dominated trade during the 18th and 19th centuries. This wasn't some side issue. This was key to the development of places like Britain. You know, if you think about how important, we think of the Industrial Revolution and we don't remember where the cotton came from. That was all slave-produced cotton. So this was not a side issue. So what went on in the United States in regards to slavery was just one story of slavery, and that's become the dominant story of slavery, when only 4% of all people who were enslaved actually went to the United States.
I found this out recently.
It was much more of a Caribbean and South American story than it was a North American story, because tropical produce could not really be produced in the States.
So just so that people are clear, because we did say we were gonna come back to America a few times. So you said the roots narrative, and there is this thing with America, they're very good at telling stories. And because the stories are so good and the budget is there to make these movies, and we see it again and again and again, we all ingest that as the model for what happened. But what you're saying is only 4% of all the slaves from West Africa actually went to North America. So the story is a much more, it's Caribbean and Brazilian, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a much darker story. It's a much more of a...
It's darker than Roots.
It's darker than Roots, It's much bloodier than Roots. That's the other thing as well. You got to understand that. From when you got off that slave ship, if you made it across the ocean, first of all, if you were in the Caribbean, chances were you weren't going to reproduce, especially if you're a woman.
Right.
And on top of that, your life expectancy, as soon as you get off that ship, is reduced to at best between 3 and 10 years. So this is where, terms like seasoning. Yeah, so when something has been seasoned, it's well done, it's proofed, I can't even remember the word.
Ready for consumption.
Yeah, it's ready to go. It's proved itself.
Yeah.
That comes from slavery. A slave who was seasoned they'd got through their first season
and not died.
Yeah, and not died, exactly. So
when you said the women are unlikely to reproduce, why was that?
Well, mortality rates always outdid birth rates.
Always
outdid birth. There was always a need to renew, because you couldn't in the Caribbean, you couldn't. There was no natural increase. Only in North America did enslaved people did birth outdo death rates.
Every time I hear you talk, there's a new chamber that opens, and I'm like, hang on, this is going to take a few days to process. So, okay, I'm just going to ask you a really cruel question. Like, if we're slave owners, why would we not want the people we've bought to reproduce? Why would we not give them that opportunity?
Well, the way we live in a throwaway culture now, where you can't repair anything, and having to pass laws.
Yeah.
It was simply down to the bottom line. It was cheaper to import more than to take care of them well. So to give them good food, to give them good clothing, to make sure they had access to medicine.
Right.
That cost more than import. Just wearing them out.
So wear them out, let them die.
Wear them out, yeah. The slavery as an institution, transatlantic slavery, is an unacknowledged Holocaust.
Right.
Yeah, because this was something that ate people up. You just worked them to death, just like the Nazis did in the camps in Europe.
Yeah.
You just worked them to death.
And
the plantations were the largest forced labor camps on earth. So you think of Barbados, where people go and have a wonderful holidays. They're usually having them on former plantations. Where enslaved people were literally worked to death.
The Dominican.
Dominican's just as bad. Yeah.
Just as bad as anywhere.
Haiti particularly.
Yeah.
So the opposite side of the island, because that's one island.
Yeah.
That was like the French equivalent of Jamaica.
Right.
And Jamaica was one of the worst places. If you end up in Jamaica, you were done for. People, slave owners in the United States would threaten slaves on their plantations. If you don't behave yourself, I'll sell you down to Jamaica.
Because that was a death sentence.
Yeah, that was a death sentence. That was exactly.
So as awful as we see in the various films like Roots and
12 Years a Slave.
12 Years a Slave, and even the Quentin Tarantino movie, there's scenes in that but they're real depictions of mutilations that would take place regularly. You're still more likely to survive and procreate than you are if you go down to the Caribbean.
Absolutely. And if you read some of the adverts for Runaways, it tells you what mutilations have been done to them. Noses cut off, ears cut off, branded on the face. These are the things that you can read in the newspapers from the time that tell you how these people were treated, you know?
And this would be done to discipline and punish them.
Yeah, totally. Any recalcitrants, you just, lop off a bit of the body parts.
As long as it doesn't stop them from working.
As long as it doesn't stop them from working.
Now, you mentioned concentration camps, Holocaust, we've got Stalin and his millions, Pol Pot, Hitler. How many people went from West Africa over to the Caribbean and South America?
Well, we'll never truly know. But the estimates are between 12.5 million and about 20 million people. It's the largest forced migration in the history of the world, even to this day.
Right.
And this was all done in ships of sail.
So I read a professor recently, and the number I read was 12.5 million, but you're saying it could be 20 million.
Oh, yeah. 12.5 million is a conservative estimate.
So how many people fit in the bottom of a boat?
Well, there you go. So a lot of ships never sailed with the quota that they were made for. They were always overpacked. So you may well have seen the first great poster for a public human rights campaign, which is the poster of the Brooks ship. You know, the ship that with all the enslaved people laid out like sardines on it. That was a Liverpool ship called the Brooks.
Right.
The people who Brooks Alley, just off Hanover Street, is named after. That was where their house was.
Right.
That shows legal berths for that ship. 450. But that ship, on any of its registered voyages that we know about, never sailed with less than 600 people on board. So you're looking at it as, you know, that coffin, you know, that ship with them laid out like sardines. That's what it would have looked like if it was done
The regular,
legally.
yeah,
but
the
there was
legal amount.
There was never 150 more were on there on every voyage. So they would have been lying on top of each other, and you know, and you could imagine the terrible conditions.
Yes.
You know, you could be at sea for over 3-4 months. You know,
3 or 4 months.
3 or 4 months
of lying on top of each other, just
rolling around, chained up to each other. People would die and be left next.
Dead bodies next to you.
So you can imagine the trauma that would
Excrements
create.
everywhere. People just And the other thing I thought as well was like so if it was illegally 600 per ship, I'm no mathematician, but to get to 12 million to 20 million people on a 3-month voyage, how many? There must have been banging out the ships.
Oh, totally. Well, Liverpool gets into the slave trade late.
Right.
Yeah. So Bristol and London's been involved for about 100 years before Liverpool gets involved. Bristol has been involved for about 50 years before. Liverpool only really becomes involved in the 1690s. But within 50 years, we've overtaken both of them. And by the end of the slave trade, more than 5,300 voyagers had left Liverpool engaged in the slave trade.
And how did we overtake? Was it the speed with which we were building the ships?
The proficiency, the speed, the innovations that we did. It was cheaper to fit out a ship here because we didn't have that long tradition as well. They had guilds in places like London and Bristol. Yeah. So there was an etiquette around slaving.
We didn't bother with that.
We didn't bother with that. Listen, Liverpool is it's a cutthroat entrepreneurial city. People came here from elsewhere. The great saying, "Go west, my son," that we associate with the United States. You could apply that to Liverpool at the beginning of the 18th century. People came here to get ahead. There's no guilds. There was no way you could come in, and if you had a bit of money, you could do it yourself. Type of thing.
So it's a city built on narcissistic psychopathy.
Well,
I'm joking.
No.
I still have to go out.
Well, what I would suggest to you is that a lot of those merchants who were involved in that, they definitely did see themselves as being, like you're saying, cutthroat, not necessarily moralistic people, but just wanted to get ahead in the world. You know,
pure capitalism.
It's the birth of modern capitalism as we know it. You know, which leads on to the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so the sheer number of voyages, it's not just from the UK. There's other places in Europe. I mean, just how long was the slave trade going on for?
If you're talking about the entire period, including the Portuguese, more than 400 years.
More than 400 years. And the British involvement?
That goes on for about, the first voyages are in the 1560s, and then we abolish slavery in 1807. All these figures, though, are also based on legal ships. So Liverpool merchants were still fitting out slave ships as late as the 1860s. Hence the reason why I said you will never truly know the true figures. And then you've obviously got all the people who die in transit, either on the West Coast, in West Africa, or on the slave ships. So there's lots of people who didn't actually make it,
And that would just be accepted as wastage.
Totally. Like cattle.
Cattle.
Absolutely.
I remember seeing in the film The Amistad years ago where they're being chased by the Brits who've decided it's now naughty to do this and they're policing the seas and they just dump people overboard. Was there a historical incident to that?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. 100%. They would do that.
Like drug dealers throwing coke out the window.
Absolutely. That happened on many occasions. So there's all those horror stories associated with it. And then that is just one aspect. Then you've got all the work that you're doing on the plantations.
Right.
So if you were in a Caribbean sugar plantation, when it's harvest time, the sugar goes off, it's hot, sugar's high sugar content, it ferments very quickly. So you have to get it all processed, within like 24, 48 hour period. So slaves would be working, many of this, and if you go back to before they had steam engines, they'd be crushing the cane using human power. you know, and having to do things like stick, you know, the type of stuff that we associate with factories. When you'd have to stick your hand in order to, you know, pull something out, and your hand might get caught in them and get mangled. There'd always be someone there with a chopper, with a machete to chop arms off.
Right.
You know, because the people would be, you know, if you're working 14, 16, 18-hour days.
You get delirious.
Yeah, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's so much there. Yeah. And I think, you know, and especially in light of this show, I think a lot of that intergenerational trauma is still evident within these societies. You know, life is cheap.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? You know, and the extraction of wealth to build here has left those countries underdeveloped, which has lots of knock-on effects that manifest themselves through violence. Do you know what I mean? Think about Jamaican yardie culture and stuff like that. You know, these are countries that they were only ever, the only infrastructure that was created to get things from the plantations to the docks, to the sea. You know, there was nothing about the people there. There was no, you know, there's no idea that we need to establish these things so that the people of this country can benefit from them. It was all about wealth extraction, you know?
So what you're saying is that sort of leaves like an imprint on the population. The colonial forces leave, we've decided this is illegal now, but it's still in the imprint of the psyche to be brutal with each other and to just take as much as you can.
Life is cheap. Live for the day. Don't plan. You don't know if you're going to be here tomorrow. Family is broken up. This is the other thing. You know, you could go out to do a hard day's work in the cane, you know, in the cane fields, come home and your son's been sold.
Yeah.
Your wife's been sold. You'll never see them again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Mentally, how does that affect you? That type of trauma, and living knowing that day to day, every day you go out, you know, once you've got a child, is that a curse or a blessing? Yes. Every day you go out, you could come home and that child might not be there.
And the child can be used as a threat.
Absolutely.
Do as you're told or else.
Absolutely.
And your wife can be used as a threat. So, I mean, there's so much to go into on that, because if you do look at that as an imprint for intergenerational trauma, it would make you violent, life is cheap, it would make attachment difficult, impossible, dangerous in fact. It's dangerous to attach, because now the question would be, would that still be in the population? So if slavery ends in America, when is it 1864? Five, yes. The Emancipation Proclamation. And then you say, well, 100 years later, would the resonance and the echo of that still be there? From a psychological point of view, we'd be saying absolutely, because if you're 1965, you can point to your grandmother or your grandfather who lived it. So yeah, it's definitely going to be there. And these things, it's hard to track in a scientific way psychologically, but we definitely know that, like, if the cultural coordinates are there and nothing stops them, they just continue. Absolutely. It just plays out that way.
And even, it's not even like, especially in the United States, because that's a society that was dominated by white people by the beginning of the, certainly by the beginning of the, well, by the middle of the 19th century. So even though slavery ends, the system doesn't change. You've got that institutional racism, as they call it, you know, so you've got Jim Crow laws, you know, which stop black people from being able to take advantage of all the rights that are supposedly associated with being an American citizen.
Yeah.
So you can't vote. You know, you can't take on any of the professions. You can't get a decent education in most circumstances. There's all kinds of laws to stop you from settling in. So even if you do well in a capitalist society, one of the things you tend to do is move out to the suburbs. Well, if you're black, you couldn't do that because they would redline. You know, so you'd have areas that were all white and areas that were all black, and that was kind of, you know, that was just another legacy of all the system that had been created during slavery. And that's still something that people are having to deal with even to this day. You know, when you see when you see George Floyd getting, you know, because life is, you know, black life is considered to be cheap. And that's not something that wasn't something that someone woke up with yesterday and thought about. It goes right back to the period where, you know, black people were lynched. You know, you can read about lynchings and the horrific lynchings of people, and that's something that stayed in the DNA of that country, you know, up until now, I would suggest, certainly in many ways.
Just as an aside, you're a historian, you can't avoid psychology, really. Absolutely. What do you think led to that level of hatred that would lead to lynchings? And obviously with the lynchings, there weren't just, yes, people were hanged to death, but they were also mutilated as well, typically. What do you think leads to that? What do you think the situation is that leads to that sort of...
It's a lot of those ideas that come up during slavery. So black people are not completely human. Their lives don't matter. They can be used for entertainment and, you know, sport, if you like. And I think that it really emanates out of that. That's why you see it in places more, not only, but more viscerally in states that held slavery for much longer. So, you know, if you think about the northern states, which you consider to be a bit more sophisticated, they abolished slavery long before your Mississippis or your Georgias or your Texas, where most of these extrajudicial lynchings, not all, but most of them, actually took place. So that's a very easy way of measuring how that history of slavery has helped to shape events that take place long after the slavery in the slave trade has ended.
So obviously, like as we were saying, there is that history, and it's recent history. You're given freedom. You've been on a plantation all your generations before you, your whole life. So you're not set up for modern American culture. You're basically you're now a refugee in America. And what you're saying is, on top of that, that would fuck you up anyway. Like, how are you going to go? What are you going to go and be a cobbler now in the local town? I mean, or a hat maker? Even if you did, and you had the determination to do that, you would still be stopped by laws that would forbid. Now, were there laws preventing economic growth? And were they? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, there was segregation. So
right.
Black people, some Black people could do well providing services to Black people, but you couldn't go outside of that community and grow your business further. Obviously, white people could provide services to Black people, but certainly not the other way.
And was that law?
That was law. I mean, most of this is codified into American law. If you think about a place like Alabama, you know, miscegenation, a black man marrying a white woman and vice versa was illegal up until the 1960s.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's how close these laws were. This was all codified. You know, you had poll taxes that meant, you know, if your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. Do you know what I mean? You had literacy tests as well. So, you know, like you just pointed out, if you've lived on a plantation, to teach slaves how to read or write was illegal. Do you know what I mean? So you come off that plantation, you haven't got an education. How can you make your way in the world?
I didn't actually know it was illegal.
It was absolutely illegal during slavery to educate slaves.
So if you had
knowledge was dangerous.
Absolutely,
you know, if you think about the people who led most of the insurrections, they were all people who had been taught how to read. Do you know what I mean? And that's so it was always considered to be taboo, you know, to be able to teach anyone how to do that. And if you did do it, you know, there was recourse to law.
So if a white person decides, I'm gonna, I don't know, maybe they're Christian, they've got some high ideals, and they say, I'm gonna provide literacy, they could actually be punished by law for teaching slaves to read. There's a lot, There's so much to unpack there, isn't there? I mean,
and I think when people think about these things, they don't put it into the historical context. Context is everything.
It's everything.
You can't understand how we live our lives today if you don't know the historical context. You know this because you come on the walks. Liverpool would not have become the city that it became off its own back. It was because of trade with other places. We don't have a manufacturing industry here. We never really had not a large scale manufacturing history here. So how did we develop? Well, we developed because of the sea. And the places that we tended to trade with were not the rest of Europe. We're westward facing port, aren't we?
Yeah.
So we looked out towards the Americas and West Africa. These are the two places that make Liverpool great. And that's really well depicted on our beautiful town hall, where you have one figure which represents Africa and another figure which represents the Americas. There's no Europe on there.
Right.
Because Liverpool's trade comes from those two great continents.
So we've always been, in that sense, like an outward-looking city.
Absolutely, 100%. And Liverpool could not have developed the way that it did if it hadn't been that. You know,
one of the things I learned on your tour is that we've had some pretty intimate history with America. Even you were saying in the Civil War, like we were helping them to keep the slave trade going. We wanted to help the South.
Absolutely. Well, you've got to understand that by the 1850s, £14 million in 1850s money was coming into Liverpool every year because of the cotton trade. Liverpool was responsible for the importation of 6/7 of all the cotton that was produced in the slaveholding states in the US. So, say that again.
Liverpool
was responsible for the importing of 6/7 of all the cotton that was produced in the slaveholding United States.
Importing to the whole of Europe.
Europe.
So we took 6/7 of the cotton.
6/7. That's why we had the cotton exchange here. So the cotton, even to this day, 60 to 70% of all the world's cotton is bought and sold using the Liverpool arbitration rules, the rules that were developed here in Liverpool for the efficient buying and selling of cotton. This brought people from all over Europe here. So that's a lot of Greek people came here to buy cotton, a lot of Poles, Germans, people from all over Europe had to come to Liverpool in order to purchase cotton. And this was all basically off the back of slave production.
So it's not even a question of how many slaves came here, or we weren't bringing slaves up from Africa and then sending them over. It's part of the slave economy.
Absolutely. And that's what really grows Liverpool. So although we made a massive amount of money through buying and selling enslaved people, supplying them to the plantations, it's really the goods that enslaved people produced that sees Liverpool's greatest growth during the 19th century, because we are, people call Manchester Cottonopolis. Well, if Manchester's Cottonopolis, we're certainly Cottonopolis as well.
Right.
They just manufactured the goods that we bought and sold, they manufactured goods out of the raw materials that we bought and sold.
So we brought them in, and then they
absolutely.
did something.
And there was so many benefits to Liverpool because of that. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway being one of them, first intercity passenger railway in the world. The idea was not to move passengers. That was built for freight, and primarily they thought it would be cotton freight. Yeah. And at the height, it was responsible for the transportation of 31% of all the cotton that came into Liverpool from the United States was put on the train and sent up to Manchester. So that was the motivation for us establishing the great Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which totally transformed Britain during the 19th century. It was the rail, the transport system that continued to see us lead the Industrial Revolution throughout the 19th century.
So with all that money coming into Liverpool, you said 14 million a year. I don't know what that would be if you account for inflation, but it's a huge amount of money. It must have created a lot of new money. There must have been a lot of new money millionaires.
Absolutely. I mean, that's
based in the city.
Coming back to what you said about the Civil War, that's why it was said of Liverpool by one American visitor that he saw more Confederate flags flying here than in Richmond, Virginia. And Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, because merchants were becoming so fabulously wealthy in a very short period of time in some cases, certainly during the Civil War itself, the cotton famine, great fortunes were made and great fortunes were lost. So throughout that period, lots of new, and most of these people aren't coming from old money. Most of these people from the 18th century right up into the 19th century were people who were just of the middling sorts, as to be called, that might have a little bit of money behind them, but certainly don't come from great families, and would be considered nouveau riche today. That's very. This is the beginning of the nouveau riche in this country. Is the birth of modern capitalism, where people who don't come from aristocratic backgrounds or even landed gentry could become fabulously wealthy within one generation.
What year was it when the American came over and saw the Confederate flag?
That was during the war, so it's probably 1862,
around
maybe.
There.
Yeah. And this is funny if you're talking about the Civil War, because this has even been commemorated in one of the greatest films of Hollywood's golden age. So you may have seen Gone with the Wind. Well, there's this great scene in Gone with the Wind where Scarlett's made the dress out of green curtains, and she goes to visit Rhett, who's been captured by the Union troops, and she asks him for money. Yeah. And he responds by saying, "I have no money. All my money's in Liverpool, not in Atlanta." Because these merchants were sending all the money over here to the partners who were based right here in Liverpool. And that book was written more than 70 years after the end of the war. So Margaret Mitchell obviously realised the importance of Liverpool to supporting the South during that war and recorded it in the book. In the book, Liverpool's mentioned more than 15 times.
Is there any historical record of people viewing the newly rich with disdain because they dirtied themselves with the slave trade? Was there any looking down on that? Or?
Not so much because of that. They would be looked down at because they weren't sophisticated. Okay. They weren't well read. Some of these people were literally bumpkin, greengrocers, ironmongers, tallow chandlers. These weren't people who come from these learned backgrounds, you know. And so they were looked down upon because they didn't have fantastic libraries, but they, like when I don't want to be disparaging, but when we have this idea of like the modern celebrity who can't string two words together, has never read a book.
Be disparaging on my channel of these pathetic
the ones that might have the satin furniture, do you know what I mean? But don't have one book in the house, or will say, I hate books, that type of thing. That's very much, that's very much how these people were looked at. So one woman who was the daughter of a Birmingham gunsmith, a very famous Birmingham gunsmith, a man called Samuel Galton, his guns are still well talked about and very collectible to this day. She would come to Liverpool with her father when she was a child in the 1790s, and he sold lots of guns to these slave traders. Guns were wanted back in West Africa in order to buy slaves, you know, and to raid for slaves. So they were always a very highly prized item. So she would come here to do his orders. And she remembered going into a house where and she goes, the house was furnished beautifully, you know, drapes everywhere, blah, blah, blah. But there was none of them had a library. That was what she said. There's a dig, you know, to say, you know, these people are just unlearned, you know.
Like low class.
Exactly.
No taste kind of
exactly.
thing. Yeah. Glitterati, nouveau riche.
That's exactly, yeah.
So they were looked down on from a class point of view, but there wasn't a sense of like, there was no moral sort of judgment.
Not so much. Some people did, but it was more out of jealousy, I think, because, you know, people, you know, if you think about it, it was the aristocracy who started off the Royal African Company. The Duke of York, who became James II.
Yeah.
He was the man who was the first president of the Royal African Company. Right. So it was something that was associated with the upper classes, the higher echelons.
Yeah.
But because that didn't continue with a monopoly the way the East India Company did, it allowed these usurpers, these, you know, interlopers to get in there.
These upstarts.
Do you know what I mean? Literally upstarts, and they'd club together, raise enough to send a ship out, and if it made a big profit, they'd do it again and again and again. And so Liverpool had these fabulously wealthy merchants who had literally started out as greengrocers or, you know, cabin boys.
There's some films to be made here.
Absolutely.
Forget all your Avengers crap. Let's tell these stories.
I mean, and truth really is stranger than fiction. I would love to do. I mean, I'm when I finish this PhD, I'm definitely going to write a screenplay for some of these stories that, you know, what went on. And you would not believe some of the incredible stories of things that went on here in Liverpool. You would think I'd made them up, you know, honestly.
Because, some of the stories you told me, or some of the things I read that I thought was like film. It was one of the stories I read on your Facebook group was film level. Isn't it the case that there was a slave who came into the city and a free black man saw him, and didn't he help him?
Yeah, totally.
How did that play out?
Well, there was actually a hostel for runaway slaves in Liverpool.
Was it really?
Established by the man who was the father of the first Everton team doctor. David Francis just come out and said a man called William Powell Jr. He was a black man, educated in Liverpool, became a surgeon, ends up serving in the United States Army during the Civil War as a surgeon. But his father had come over here in about 1850, disgusted by the passing of the fugitive slave law, which meant that runaway slaves who'd got to the north, in the past they would be free. No one could come and grab them and take them back to slavery legally. But after that law was passed, slave hunters could go up from the southern states and legally recapture formerly enslaved people who'd managed to run away.
That law was passed when Lincoln was in?
No, that was 1850. So Lincoln comes in 1860.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in 1850, this law is passed.
To stop runaway slaves from just getting to the north?
Exactly. Well, to say you can go up and get them. So this led to abolitionist circles sending a lot of enslaved people either up into Canada, which was British controlled, or over here. So on the tour, one of the tours, one that you haven't been on, I consider Liverpool to be the last stop on the Underground Railroad. Right. Because enslaved people would come to Liverpool because that was now finally far enough away from the United States in order to be safe. And William Powell, who was a free black, he comes to Liverpool, brings his family, sets up a hostel in Everton, where he supports runaway slaves.
Oh, wow.
You know, so there's all these types of stories that have literally not been told and need to be told, give you a totally different opinion of what Liverpool must have been like.
Yeah, it's strange because I was trying to think, like, you know, I'm trying to imagine it and think, okay, you're walking down the road, you see somebody. I think in that story, he was on his own, he was on an errand or something, and somebody just says, all right, mate.
Yeah, they knew each other, James Pennington and James Watkins.
Did they already know each other from before?
And Pennington writes in James an introduction in Watkins' biography, it's called The Slave Narrative, authenticating the fact that he is actually a runaway slave. Right. You know what I mean? And James Pennington then gave his address as Edge Hill. Right. You know, so it must have been, you know, Herman Melville comes here and he talks about seeing a black steward arm in arm with a white woman, because obviously in America, he says, if that was in New York, they would have been torn limb from limb.
Really?
Yeah.
Just passers by would have just killed them.
Exactly, because, you know, these race has been codified in different places differently. So it was fine to just attack black people in those countries because they had these opinions of black people that, that would be anathema. But here, there was already a well-established mixed race community by the 1850s.
And people
well-established.
weren't particularly fussed about
No,
it.
certainly. It was a lot of the times it was Americans who came here who were horrified. Like Herman Melville, he pointed that out, whether or not he was horrified. But there's lots of nasty racist attacks that take place in Liverpool in the 1840s, perpetrated by Americans on either black people or white women who had black children.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, all this is to be told,
Yeah.
I would go as far as to say, we in 2008 we used the slogan "The World in One City" when we won the Capital of Culture thing. That was our slogan. I would say Liverpool was more multicultural 150 years before then. So in 1858 we were much more multicultural than we were in 2008. Because at that time we are the great gateway to empire.
And so many different European people, American people are
people from all over the globe. By the 1850s, the East India Company's lost its monopoly. So you've also got the Chinese community established here, the Indian community. As I told you, there was an area, the area that we now consider to be Chinatown, that was known as Little Africa. Right. So that was an area that was associated with black settlements going right back into the 19th century.
How did it end up being? The Chinese community here has got a long history as well, right?
Yeah. So as soon as the East India Company lose its monopoly, these cutthroat English businessmen are in there straight away, setting up the Blue Funnel Line and getting involved in China trade. So lots of Chinese men come to Liverpool, establish themselves here and have children, have families, etc. And that begins our very long history of Chinese settlement as well.
So, I've got so many questions there. That particular story of the guy who sees his mate and he, because to me I'm just like, okay, did we have laws in those times for kidnap? Like if I kidnap him now in those, wouldn't that be illegal?
Yeah, that would be absolutely illegal.
Yeah. What sort of like mental gymnastics were we doing that said, okay, slavery is okay, but I can't kidnap and torture somebody else and force them to work for me?
Okay, so we've got to go back to a different period then. So the 1850s, that's totally illegal. But if you go back into the 18th century, when there were slaves, so don't forget, Britain abolishes the slave trade in 1807.
Yeah.
But slaves were living in England as slaves from the 17th century, but certainly in Liverpool from the 18th century.
Right.
So because there'd been a lot of debate about whether or not a slave who was in the British Caribbean and the colonies who was a slave continued to be a slave here, they were asked for legal opinions. So in 1729, the York Talbot opinion is given, which says, yes, a slave who's a slave in Jamaica is still a slave when they come to England, and they can be compelled to forced against their will to do X, Y, Z. So this continues on then for 43 years until Lord Mansfield gives his judgment in 1772, where he says, no, a slave cannot be compelled. He's very specific with how he words it as well, so it's important to say this. He cannot be compelled to leave their country against their will, because that would have been an act of kidnap. Yeah. Because we did not acknowledge slavery in this country. There was never a law saying you are a slave. Slavery exists in this country where it did in the colonies. Okay. So although he never ruled on whether or not a slave remains a slave, they said that if a slave is in this country, you cannot force them to go back to Jamaica where they are legally, unequivocally a slave. Okay. And that was the only ruling that was ever done. But slaves still are bought and sold in Liverpool after the 1772 Act, after this opinion or decision by Mansfield in 1772. So this is why it's a bit like muddy. Right. But by the 1850s, that was long out of fashion. There was no way anyone could have said, he's my slave.
You couldn't do that.
You couldn't have done that. In the 1820s, slaves were still being brought here from Brazil. If you look at the records of St. George's Church, Everton, the beautiful iron church. Yeah. So slaves are being baptized in there right up until the 1820s. And I was able to trace one of them who stopped someone in the street, like this James Pennington, James Watkins, and asked this black guy, I'm a slave and he wants to take me back to Brazil. I don't want to go. And this guy helps him on the street. He just says, take all your clothes. Take
your master's clothes off.
Yeah, because he could have been done for theft. Right. But he couldn't have been done for stealing himself, which is something that in the past, that would have been done. So James Watkins, as late as when he's here in the 1850s, he's going around looking for work. And he said he found it very difficult to find work in Liverpool because the merchants, many of whom were benefiting from the slave economy, considered him to be contraband in his own person. He'd stolen himself from his master by running away. So he ends up moving to Manchester. Do you know what I mean? So there's all these fascinating stories that make you question how people must have seen the world in a society that considered itself to be Christian.
Do you know and civilized.
And civilized,
because
exactly.
the basis upon which we, went out and colonized was we were, bringing democracy and civilization.
Civilizing the savage hordes.
Civilizing the savage hordes. And yet we've got open kidnap and sort of flouting these British laws openly. So it would be interesting to go back in time and just say somebody like, how are you disassociating all these different facts? Was it, I know that in America it was done along racial lines. Was it done along racial lines or national lines here? They're African. Is that how it would be done?
Well, there was racism that was developing here, but it was never legally codified. So that's why racism, I would say, in Britain has never been truly as visceral. And it's far more covert. So you never saw signs up saying black people can't eat here. You just go in and wouldn't be able to get served, or you get snarled at, do you know what I mean?
Right.
You didn't see that. Okay, we did have no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs in the windows, but that was never something that was legally allowed to be done. Do you know what I mean? It was just like the choice of the owner to do that. But if you're in the States, there were laws, literally laws that were on the statute books that said, if you do this, you will go to jail. So those types of things existed, but that never existed here. And that's why the racial lines in this country have always been far more blurred, or racism in this country seemed more civilized. It's always been more about the individual rather than the society. So if someone treats you bad because of your race, it's because of them as an individual rather than this oppressive society that says, no, you're black, you can't do this.
Right.
But obviously if everyone or a majority of people take on that opinion, it doesn't matter whether it's sanctioned by law or not, because your everyday reality is shaped by that.
Yes.
And that's something that we really have to take into consideration when thinking about British society as opposed to American society.
I did, when I was at the Life Cafe and there was the comedy club there, one of the compares, Reginald D. Hunter. Do you remember Reg?
Yeah.
And he did a bit about British racism and he was like, it's good to see you guys try. You'll give it a go, but you don't do it the way we do it. And he's from, I think, Georgia or Carolina or Alabama. And he was like, no, it's different there. But like you say, I suppose it's the idea of legally codifying racism is something we just... I mean, we've never gotten close to that.
No, not at all. It's shaped. It's really that. It comes back to all these things that you're talking about our psyche, and how we see people. You know, if you knew the law would back you up if you mutilated or killed someone, that psyche narcissistic personality disorder, it's easier for it to manifest itself.
Of course.
Do you know what I mean? It doesn't have to do behind closed doors. You don't have to bury the body. Do you know what I mean? You can do it openly. Take photographs and take souvenirs and then, put the postcards as they did. You see postcards of lynchings from the 20th century. People taking the whole family along and having a picnic while you can smell the smell of burning flesh in the air. You have to start asking yourself.
I wondered with that. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Portugal, and I went to see Mississippi Burning when I was 12 at the local Portuguese cinema, and we got old American TV shows from the 50s on Portuguese network TV. So I'd watched the Twilight Zone, black and white, with mainly Americans, white American characters, and then I watched Mississippi Burning, and when I was a 12-year-old, I was like, oh, this is the Twilight Zone. It's like an episode of The Twilight Zone. And I went home and Mum was like, what was the film like? And I told her the film and I was like, it wasn't believable though. Because they're killing these people for no reason. She's like, that happened. And it blew my mind. I was like, for years, like going, but what for?
That's actually a true story as well.
It's a completely true story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's based on the murders of the 3 civil rights workers who went down to register people to vote, and they murdered them, executed them, mutilated them.
One of them was one of the lads was tortured as well.
Oh yeah, they chopped his thing off and put it in his mouth. Yeah, and then buried them all 3. The black guy they did that to. There's 2 Jewish guys as well. Yeah, beat them to death and then beat them and then shot them to death. Yeah. From
sort of when I was growing up and I started studying psychology, and I'd think about that, and I'd think maybe this is guilt. Sometimes when you see aggression, it can be suppressed guilt. And you've got people there who are a reminder of something that you don't like about yourself. You'd see that in a family unit, in narcissistically abusive family units, post-sexual abuse. The guilt doesn't lead you to the perpetuator of the abuse, doesn't lead you to be nice to the designated target. Sometimes it can. You overcompensate by giving too much, but sometimes you overcompensate with aggression because you're making me feel guilty, so fuck you even more. And I as you say, it's an American thing, because for Brits, we see some of this and we're like, fucking hell, what you doing? Where's this aggression coming from? And I do wonder if it's something in like a guilty conscience that leads to that level of aggression that justifies the crime. So if you dehumanize somebody and make them the black sheep of the family, then you go, well, that justifies what I did because they were worthless anyway. Not seeing the cycle.
Absolutely. And, I'm nodding my head so heartily because I see that just in the stuff that I post about history and the responses that you get, these visceral, like, they don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear, you're in a history group. Yeah. And I'll put a history post up about Liverpool's history.
I've read your comments section.
Do you know what I mean? So you see exactly what I'm talking about.
It's madness.
And for me, that is a response, because people, when you telling all these like lovely fuzzy stories about, nurses and Florence Nightingale, that's all great. Yeah. We can pat ourselves. But if you bring out the dirty linen and start airing that, what are you doing? I don't want to hear that. Get away. It's all that, that response, that overly aggressive response to someone because you now feel guilty, even though you may not have had anything to do with it. And I think that it can be in the psyche of a city. I know it's not a real, it's not a living and breathing mental, symbiont thing. But I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have a conscience as such. Yeah. But it's reflected in the way people's opinions of the city have kind of been shaped. And when you start airing that, when you start talking about this history that they don't like talking about, it's like you're a bad person. Why are you bringing this up? Don't want to hear about that. Yeah.
It is.
Move on in a history group.
Move on in a history group. No, I've seen some of the comments and it is bewildering. And then, I get annoyed and I've sometimes typed out a shitty comment and I delete it and I'm like, no, you're supposed to be mature.
Mate, you don't, so many times.
You just go, just delete that. And then I thought, well, okay, back to psychology and abusive family units. We have an image of ourselves individually. And then we have an image of ourselves as a group, as a city, as a nation. And if you raise something that affects my image and I'm attached to it, then I'll respond defensively, which is a kind of collective narcissism. Yeah. Because it's an investment in a false image.
Absolutely.
That all nations, we all have darkness. I mean, we didn't just pop out in 2021, all a bunch of progressives. Like
exactly.
We're all guilty.
Exactly. And when we can have those honest discussions, they can be healing. Yeah. You can get over it. You can talk about this. You can openly discuss it. Yeah. And it becomes less of a confrontational type of scenario. Yeah. And that's where I would hope that my work is kind of leading to. So from coming on the walks, I certainly don't try and make people feel guilty. I certainly don't try and make out like this is your fault and it's a black or white issue, because it's not a black or white issue.
Well, that would be madness, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
You'd be talking possibly to an Irish or like...
Exactly. But see, this is what race has done. So this is the social construct of race and why it's such a stupid concept. This idea that you can group people into groups based on the color of their skin. Yeah. Identity politics, as we call it now. Yeah. The only problem I have with people discussing identity politics is when people on the right talk about it, they tend to forget that they were the ones who created it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So, when people talk about identity politics now, it's very much viewed from the perspective of the left wing. So they're the ones who identify with groupings rather than seeing themselves as individuals. Yes. But that only exists as a concept because during the period that I talk about, the dominant population created that in order to give them inherent advantage. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't black people who turned around and said, we're black. Yeah. Because those slaves who got on those slave ships, they didn't see themselves as black because everyone where they came from was black. They were Igbo, Fulani, Fulbe, Yoruba, and all the other myriad numbers of different groups and peoples that live in West Africa.
It's almost like you're saying that Africa is not a country. It's like a continent.
Exactly. With so many different belief systems. If you think about the way we fought against the French or the way we slaughtered the Irish, we obviously didn't see them as being the same as us simply because they shared the same colour skin. Yeah. So it was for Africans. Yeah. But it's when you take them out of their country and put them into the diaspora, whether it's in the North, United States or in the Caribbean or in Latin America, you then create them as one homogenous gloop and call them all black.
Wow, you've just used exactly the word that I used a few weeks ago when I was defending. Like, somebody was saying to me, "You can't talk about this because you're white," and I was like, "Okay, I understand your frustration and your pain, but when you gloop me, it's humiliating. Like, and so now I'm silenced now because I can't change this."
I only use the terminology because it's what other people understand.
Right, you have
do you know
to,
what I mean?
to be,
yeah, you have
to be coherent.
To be coherent, do you know what I mean? It's another reason why I don't get onto, like, you know, when you hear old people call someone coloured, I'd never correct them because that's the language of their day. They're not saying it in order to be offensive, although that word now may be considered offensive. It's the limitations of language. Do you know what I mean?
I worked the door with some people who preferred coloured to the older lads.
Yeah.
If somebody said black, even though you had like the Black Music Awards, when the young people would say it, they'd be like, "Hey, it changes, right?"
It changes, exactly. And it's all about intention.
Yeah.
And I acknowledge that there's limitations with language.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that's what I think. Now we've created a society where it's black, white, you know, or whatever, which has no real basis in any type of scientific thought.
Zero.
It's got nothing. You know, and I'm not a right winger, but you hear people trying to make, you know, oh well, IQ tests say blah blah blah. You know, so I don't go with any of that. All I'm saying is that I understand that black people are not a race. They don't exist as a race.
Yeah.
There's people from different backgrounds who may have more melanin in their skin, but that doesn't mean in any way they identify with someone else because they also have that amount of melanin. All you have to do is go to Africa and see all the tribal beefs that you have. Just the same with white people. You know, think about how the French have fought against the English or the French have fought against the Germans. Yeah. And these are places that are much smaller, more likely to have a shared religion. All the things that
and shared DNA because the travel.
Of course. And so, you know, why don't we look at that in the same way that we would look at Africa? Because of racism and the way racism has shaped people to think about people based on something as accidental or irrelevant as how much melanin you have in your skin. You might as well
go off like flavoured ice cream.
Totally, 100%. And this is all stuff that you can see. There's lots of scientific, you know, literature on this subject now. Yeah. And, you know, but we've kept a hold of it when it's a remnant of a time when we tried to codify people by skin colour in order to disadvantage and to advantage particular groups.
Yes.
That's where it comes from.
Which is a stupid mindset. And if we keep repeating it, it's stupefying, isn't it? We 100%. Make ourselves dumb.
100%.
We're repeating stupidity.
100%. And I only identify it with it because I need to communicate.
Yeah.
If I had time to sit down with every individual I come into contact with, I would explain to them why I think it's a spurious term.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
You'd have to have a long conversation
and
with every person.
This is what pisses me off about when right wingers talking about identity politics.
Yeah.
Because it tends to be the right wing societies, if that's what you want to call them, or these societies that we're talking about and criticizing. Who created them?
The identity politics of division, yes, because it furthered the power agenda. It wasn't about science. It wasn't about truth. It was about spinning the story a certain way, just for power. Just for power. It's back to narcissism and psychopathy.
Just so I could get the job and you couldn't.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To bring it down to a very basic level that people would understand.
Well, it's funny, you know, even within the psychology community, you still see biological essentialism and you still see people talk about race like it's a thing.
Mate, this is what I'm saying to you is look at when it was created. This idea of race comes directly out of the 18th century. So one of the great the father of polygenism, certainly one of the fathers, was a man called Charles White. He was a gynecologist who set up the Royal Infirmary in Manchester and also the Lion Inn Hospital, the obstetrics hospital. He's the polygynist. He came to Liverpool specifically to do experiments on this in the 1790s, on black people who were born in the city, because he was looking for ways to kind of explain away or explain inherent advantage or, you know, the differences, the fact that we couldn't all come from one single ancestor, whether you call it Lucy or Adam, whatever. You know, he wanted to do away with that myth because he was very much of the idea, well, black people are more primitive to white people, so we can't be the same. We can't be enslaving our brothers and sisters. That's where it comes from. Do you know what I mean?
You need the justification.
They needed the justification. It got to the point where they needed that justification, whether it was to stop them from going insane, although I would probably suggest that some of them may have been slightly off the axis anyway.
Yeah.
But they needed to be able to say, well, this is just like a chicken or a cow. So when I throw them overboard, like in the Zong, it's not a question of humanity. It's not a question of murder. It's about, you know, throwing cattle overboard in order to save the ship.
Yeah.
You know, or it's throwing wood overboard.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, these aren't humans. But you needed to create a scientific justification. for that.
And once you've committed terrible crimes and it weighs on your conscience, you have to double down and double down and double down. And you have groups doing it.
And we are the legacy of that. That's exactly that's the way you've got to
We're so fucked.
That well, you know this one. You've got to be aware of what you've done or what's happened in order to address it. If you continue to go on and you look for more spurious reasons why you don't need to address it because black people are inherently inferior because they've got lower IQs and all that type of stuff, that gives you the opportunity to kind of dismiss it. But when you start to address it very clearly and look at the intergenerational disparities between people from certain racial groups, then you have to address it. And that's the reason why I think it's important to talk about this, because I want to see society progress.
Yeah, 100%.
And I'm like you, I don't believe in this Whiggish view of history that things are always getting better. You've got to be constant. If you want things to get better, you've got to be constantly vigilant.
Yes.
Because the Second World War tells us more than anything. You know, in the 20th century, we had the bloodiest, nastiest war in the history of the world.
And relatively speaking, I'm sure you'd agree as a historian, we were very modern. Like the essential parts of society. The
Germans particularly.
The Germans, it's almost like a function of, their whole ideology is a function of modernism and science, isn't it? Or pseudoscience and technology, and Hitler was into his gadgets and all that. We were just as modern, really. We've not made huge leaps in progress since then. It's one of the things that interests me. You mentioned identity politics. I know that you stand on the left. I'm left of centre as well. What do you think? I mean, could you see from the left almost like a neo-segregationism developing at the moment?
In some ways, yeah. It's funny that you say that. I think there's a lack of tolerance on the left. And for me, that's a really difficult thing to kind of address. Rather than discuss with somebody who might have a different opinion, you'll just dismiss them, you know? And I think the right are more willing to have that discussion, even though I think their arguments may be skewed. I find that there's less of that just instant dismissal.
It's interesting, isn't it? With the right, the way they assess the world, I see it as wrong. And the left, they assess the world. And I think you're right the way you assess the world. But the conclusions they come to are bonkers, and the conclusions they come, at least you can have the debate on the right.
Well, that's it. And the other thing is, if you can have the debate, you can make people like either, you can clearly demonstrate why that person is wrong. Whereas if you just dismiss them, people going away, well, you know, you didn't even have the discussion. You just say, no, you're wrong. We started off from this position. We're not going anywhere because you're wrong. Do you know what I mean? If that's how you feel, I'd rather have the debate and make the person look foolish, because then at least for people looking in, they can say, well, he's obviously deconstructed his argument, or she's deconstructed her argument. On merit. Do you know what I mean? But this dismissing people because they may have a differing of opinion is not something that I really have any time for. And I manifest that really in my view on the statues, you know, the statues that people want to pull down now.
Yes. If you could speak on that.
Yeah, well, you know, for me, I'm all about, like, I think the greatest memorial to the victims of the slave trade is these debates that we have around it. And, you know, the statues are just another opportunity to kind of whitewash history, I think, or certainly within the public realm.
You're saying tearing the statues down?
Yeah, so tearing the statues down for me is kind of sanitizing the public realm. And I consider the public realm to be the best classroom. I can engage with a totally different demographic on the street doing the tours than I can in a lecture room or a theatre, you know, or a seminar room. You know, I get a totally different feedback. You know, I can talk to younger people who are more willing to come on a walk than they will to sit there and let me lecture to them with a PowerPoint for an hour.
Yeah.
So the debate is different. And I do see the public realm as an educational tool in itself. Never mind the fact that these memorials are now historic themselves. If you've been there 150 years, you're shaping the public realm.
Yeah.
And it tells us something about people who, when they erected that statue, what they thought about these individuals. That in itself has merit. So I'm dead set against the tearing down of those statues, because I think that then becomes one less thing that we can discuss, that we can have this debate about.
I've always said, like, not change the plaque, but put another plaque up.
Put another plaque. Yeah.
Keep the old one, keep the statue, put another plaque that says, hey, this guy's whatever. But yeah, I agree. There's something slightly frightening about that knee-jerk hysterical reaction that says tear it down. And I'm like, well, okay, understand the frustration, totally understand the anger. But this is a bit Orwellian. This is a bit Stalinist. You're now sort of unpersoning. Don't we want him? Don't we want to see what he did? And don't we want to know? like you said, it's whitewashing history.
Yeah, totally.
It's almost like leftists fulfilling a right-wing agenda.
Totally, 100%. And I would do, I say, retain and reinterpret. So you keep the memorial and you give a more complete history. I'm a historian. We revisit the past in order to find out new things. If you can write, if you can, and this is what people on the right say the opposite. They say, oh, you're rewriting history. You're not. You're just adding more scope. How many biographies of Churchill can you have? Doesn't stop a new one coming out every year, does it? Do you know what I mean? So, for me, it's about saying, we've got statues and a number of statues in Liverpool of slave traders or people who traded in slave-produced goods, gun runners. Tell these more complete stories. Don't just tell the panegyric, mid-Victorian idea of this man who's a great citizen of the city.
He's a philanthropist.
Tell him how he made his money, you know, and do it.
Get the skeletons out the closet.
And
Let's
do
have
it
a look.
openly, but don't do it, and you don't need to make it sound biased. You just, do it factually. As well as setting up the Blue Coat School, he bought, he made all his money through buying and selling enslaved people. That's how you do it. So you juxtapose the great philanthropy on one hand with the the brutality on the other of how this man decided that he would make his money.
He was only doing the philanthropy to cleanse his dirty conscience and his karma and a Jeff Bezos.
Well, what I would say is there may be some nuance. Let the person decide.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Give them the facts.
Even if it's not that isn't the conclusion that they come to.
Yeah.
You've educated them.
Yeah.
The statues help to educate them.
We shouldn't be afraid of the facts, should we?
And what I see on the left, I'll give you a really good example. So when the Colston statue came down, I've done these tours for 25 years.
25 years.
25 years. The people who were getting in touch with me, I've never seen them on a walk in my life. And they were asking me for hit lists. Which statues are involved with slavery?
And they thought you were going to be like,
I'd be like, yeah,
do these.
Do you know
next.
what I mean? I felt like saying what? I don't want to swear, but I felt like, imagine
you
that.
Swear.
You've never come on a walk. You've never shown any interest in the subject. And you're getting in touch with me now, someone you've never contacted before in your life.
So you can flex on social media.
Do you know what I mean? Exactly. There you go.
Because it's the moment.
Do you know what I mean? And that is the classic virtue signal as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
You don't have any real interest in this whatsoever. You just want to be seen pulling down a statue because it makes you look good.
I got very early on in one of your walks that like you were absolutely not down for that at all. Were statues defaced in Liverpool when that was? I was out of the country at the time. No,
they weren't defaced. There was one group which I thought was really a really good thing to do. They put like pseudo plaques on the statues. So the William Gladstone statue, again, one of the great sons of Liverpool, it mentioned how his father had made all the money and the fact that Gladstone's earlier speeches in the House of Parliament were all in defence of slavery, although he's seen as this great liberal who supported home rule for the Irish, defended the Afghans when we first invaded Afghanistan. But people tend to forget what his early career was all about. Exactly. And and for me, that was classic because you're adding something to the debate, to the discussion. You're saying, hold on, you don't need to pull this down, just give a more complete history of this individual. And that's what it's all about for me. It's about learning, and these acts of tearing down, to me, the throwaway.
Yeah. It's there's a kind of historical barbarianism to it. We don't want to burn books. We don't want to be those people, do we?
Exactly. That's what I equate it to. And some people have like really challenged me on that, but I equate it to burning books. Because I use my library is the public realm. The only reason I know the stories that I know about these is because they do have a statue. I wouldn't have known about Arthur Bower Forward's role in gun running during the American Civil War if his statue hadn't been there. Because I got to the point in my, in my curiosity where I used to go around and look at statues and say, oh, I'll look him up and see what he did. And that's how I found out about them. So those statues were educational to me because I chose to make them educational. You'll have other people who say they're not educational. They are, because they give the looker the ability to go and do further research. That in its very that in its very essence is education. I looked at this person, wasn't satisfied with the baronet and dates and births. I wanted to know what was his career about, and that's how I found out he was someone who ran guns for the Confederacy during the war.
I was just thinking that, like, in a sci-fi sort of Aldous Huxley, George Orwell way, if that reaches its logical conclusion and we get rid of all the statues of racism, what happens if there's like a cataclysm or a pandemic or something? In 100 years, we'd forget them.
And it's not even 100 years, mate. I take people to to a building that's now called Beetham Plaza, which you'll know, and I obviously know. That was renamed 20 years ago. So it's both in our lifetimes. And I take people from 8 to 80 on my tour. So people who remember when that building was built in the 60s, it used to be the tax office. I take people there and I ask them, do you remember when this building used to be called before it changed its name to Beetham Plaza? Most people who come on the walk say no. That building was called Wilberforce House. So within the same generation that it was changed, people had forgotten who it was named after. So you can't blame future generations.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You can't blame people who aren't born yet if they don't know anything about their environment because you changed the street names, pulled down the statues. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? These are all opportunities to teach people about the environment and where they live and how previous generations thought. So in the 60s, even though Wilberforce has no connection to Liverpool, was hated here because of this connection to slavery and where that building was built. Whoever named it decided that they would name it after the man who led the parliamentary campaign to abolish slavery because of Liverpool's obvious connections to supporting slavery.
Right.
And that's been lost simply by Beetham coming along and giving it a generic name or naming it after themselves. And that's why, that for me is an example of why you don't tear down statues, why you don't change names.
Because it becomes whitewashing.
Because it becomes whitewashing in the public realm, which for me, especially now with people not valuing libraries the way they did in the past, is super important as an educational tool. Bold Street, that is a street that if people go down there all the time, every day, if you change the name and change it from the slave trader who owned it, why should anyone remember that it used to be named after a slave trader? Why? They should, there's no reason for them to.
Yeah.
But while the street is still named that and you can't get away from it because you use it to navigate from one place to another, you've always got the opportunity to ask the question.
Who was bold?
Yeah.
And look it up on Wikipedia or
exactly.
whatever you like.
There you go.
There is an issue around historical literacy and illiteracy. The time that we're moving in, people are using social media for. Sometimes they'll use opportunities to flex on social media because that becomes a value. In terms of politics and running a society, do you worry about our lack of historical literacy? Like the fact that we're losing our connection with the past?
Well, I would prefer to see the social media side of things as providing us an opportunity to engage with a different demographic. My great worry is that even the people who would have been bookish in the past now choose not to be bookish because it seems to be so much easier. That's my great worry. I think there's always been some part of society that didn't engage with the written word, and social media gives us a really good opportunity to kind of engage with them. But there's nothing like having, taking that time to study and to, access, a library and use books. So I worry about it if people who traditionally have done that in the past no longer do it. But on the other side, it's it's a double-edged sword. On the other side, it gives us the opportunity to really engage with a different demographic. And that would be as being the eternal optimist, that would be how I would hope that people will consume more history in the future. If they're not going to open a book, at least watch something online. And then maybe go and say, well, you can have a film and have footnotes if people want to know where you've come up with the information. So it's an opportunity, I would like to see it as, but I do definitely worry about whether people will have that same respect in the future that they had in the past for the written word.
Coming back to the moral issue, I asked you before if people look down their noses on people who'd made money through the slave trade. If it wasn't considered an immoral act, or generally wasn't there, what was our reason for, in the UK, why did we abolish the slave trade?
I think it wasn't. I think there was always voices that were saying this is immoral, going right back to the 1740s, much earlier than people think. People like William Roscoe in Liverpool also spoke out at an early age before the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was set up. So those voices were always there. It just became more and more of an issue the closer we got to abolition.
Right.
And then it was a lot to do with Britain leading the world in terms of the Industrial Revolution. So you had the moral argument next to the technological argument of why this was becoming something that was outdated or outmoded. And so it's a combination of factors. There was definitely these moral discussions taking place, and certain people were kind of looked down their nose, certainly after, once it was well established. So for example, Gladstone used to be teased after his father got his compensation money. He then began importing Indian labour into the Caribbean because he didn't want to pay his former slaves. And these were indentured labourers as well.
Okay.
And Gladstone would be teased They would say that his father instigated the Gladstone slave trade, which was the trade in these indentured Indian laborers, who, again, you still see the descendants of them in a place like Guyana, even to this day. So I would suggest that the moral argument was there, and it was probably a very important factor, but not the only factor. I think there's definitely a technological argument that goes along with it.
You mentioned before guns used in West Africa for raiding parties. So were there incidents of white Europeans raiding in Africa and taking slaves?
Very, very infrequently.
Because I've when I'm reading online, especially when I'm talking, I have a lot of American followers, and I read the comments from Americans. It seems to be their vision of how slavery took place was white people running into Africa and stealing babies, and I'm like, I don't. So it did happen, but
it did happen in the early days.
Yeah.
But then they very rapidly realised that these people were very sophisticated people, and you couldn't get away with it, and you end up losing more people than you got.
You'd get smashed if you tried that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So it became much more developed than that. If you go to a place like Ghana, for example, today, you'll see lots of European forts along the coast. All the cannons look out to sea.
Okay.
Because they weren't afraid of the Africans kind of coming in and trying to destroy the fort and take back people who'd been captured. They're much more worried about European powers.
Okay.
They changed hands a number of times, built by the Portuguese, then the Dutch had it, then the Swedish, I'm talking about Cape Elmina, and the Swedish had it, and then eventually the British get it. So it was very much other Europeans who are looking to step on their toes.
Yeah.
But the Africans, and when I say the Africans, you've got to be so careful.
Yeah.
The elites, African elites,
Yeah.
were very much in cahoots with the European traders.
Yeah.
Again, you can't. This comes back to what I was saying to you about how race poisons everything. You know, just as people, like you're saying, Americans will look in and think of themselves, well, all black people were brothers and sisters, so there's no way they could have done that. You go and speak to an African, someone from
See
Ghana.
how brotherly they
do you know
feel.
what I mean? The Fanti and the Ashanti fought each other over who would partner with the British in the slave trade.
Right.
You know, the Fanti were in partnership with the British, so the Ashanti went to war with them because this was lucrative.
These were tribes from Ghana, was it? Yeah.
These are both Akan-speaking peoples in Ghana. So they fought against each other because they wanted to be in on the deal.
They wanted a little of that capitalist.
That's because they were just as human as white Europeans were. They would fight we would fight against the French if we could see an advantage in it. We would enslave the Irish. Talk about Bristol.
Yeah.
Bristol was a slave trade port in the medieval period when they were selling Irish people.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Because it was nothing to do with skin colour. It was all to do with power. And it's exactly the same in West Africa. What came out of the slave trade is this idea of races. Yeah. And someone being black and someone being white. Those slaves did not become black. Those enslaved people did not become black until they ended up on the slave ship.
Right.
Before then, they were Aka, they were Fanti, Fulbe, all the different peoples that I already mentioned.
So they could be enslaved right next to lifelong enemies.
Totally. And then they had to find a way of communicating in order to survive. Because once they were on that ship, you were no longer a Fulbe prince. Now you're just a slave, like the guy next to you.
Yeah.
And once you got off that plantation, you're all slaves. You're just black slaves. So you'd become black. That's how black people were created, as bizarre as that sounds.
Yeah. It's a social construct.
It's a social construct, and wherever you go, it's constructed differently.
It's like a magic spell that still perpetuates this thing.
Yeah, and it still causes so many problems, around the world. And it's a terrible. Anti-black racism is a terrible legacy of the 18th and 19th century slave trade.
There's a Slovenian philosopher called Slavoj Žižek. He was a psychoanalyst. You know Slavoj, yeah. And he often says, when we're talking about evil and race, you should let everybody have a slice of evil pie. Yes, we were just as evil. Yes, we destroyed the environment we enslaved, because it's so infantilizing to have this fake narrative. Oh no, we were just simple people, living off the land, and then there's a kind of reverse white. It's still white supremacy. You're saying those evil white people were supremely evil and therefore superior in the scale of evil. You're still just it's daft.
It's all about opportunity and agency.
Right.
If people got the opportunity to exploit someone
You're
else,
talking like a fucking psychologist now.
Sorry,
Opportunity and agency. I'm on about that all the time to people.
So if people can take advantage of other people and they can see a personal or a collective profit from it, they'll do it, and then they'll try and rationalize it. Do you know what I mean? Afterwards, and you see the legacy of that particularly in those states that were involved in the slave trade. You will see them. They'll look down their noses at other groups that they once in the past enslaved.
Right.
So you do see it, but it has to manifest itself in a different way because they're all black.
Yeah.
So they'll make another reason up why they're better than them.
Right.
So, do you know what I mean? It's only when you take these people and put them in multicultural societies that skin color becomes a factor that you use in order to justify that type of discrimination.
Yes.
Yeah. That's really how it works in that context.
Yeah.
You've got to be very careful about how you talk about it. But in that transatlantic context, that's very much how it's been shaped. But it's there in all societies.
So there was a period of time where I lived in southern Spain, and I learned a little bit about this through the Spanish point of view. And what they said was that there was already a slave trade in Africa, and it was actually the Moors trading with the Europeans with black slaves. Is there truth to that?
Yeah, and the Moors in many cases were as black as the people who they were enslaving. That's the idea. Like the black Moors used to be called blacker Moors. So the clue's in the name.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So again, slavery in Islam was shaped differently. This is why I'm saying to you, if you look at how racism is shaped in those societies, it's different, although it is still based on skin color in many ways. Yeah. But it was, I mean, and you know, so the Moors, there had been a long slave trade across the Sahara going right back to the early medieval times. So that was there. There'd been slavery in the Roman period as well, which wasn't race-based slavery. Do you know? And even Islamic slavery is not race-based slavery. The word Slav is because they would take many whites from the Slavic countries.
It's white people first.
That's where the name comes. The English, the British, the English name in the English language for slave, for an abd, as it would have been in Arabic, comes from Slav, because they were the people who they enslaved.
Who was enslaving the Slavs?
Well, everyone had to go. So you think about the Ottomans and the Balkanization of the Balkan, the idea. Yeah. So they enslaved them. The Arabs, the Barbary corsairs enslaved them.
Yeah.
Slavery was, when you didn't have prisons, that's what you did with people, with captives. Yes. You either slaughtered them or you enslaved them. So that's where it comes from. It's the thing that makes transatlantic slavery a bit different is its massive numbers.
It was almost like it's like a mechanization.
It's industrial.
Process.
It's industrial slavery because you needed it to feed the industry, and in this county particularly.
And where you did see slavery in the Roman Empire, in the Ottoman Empire, I know that the Spartans enslaved people. Was it always intergenerational, or was it a little bit looser in terms of like maybe achieving freedom in this lifetime, or?
Well, that's people. Obviously, people were able to achieve their freedom just as they were in the transatlantic slave trade. But it wasn't to the way we think of cash crops. So it was more. Oh, I certainly won't say it, but it was more of a. I would say it was more of a domestic or a paternalistic type of scenario, a bit like West African slavery in many ways. So you became part of the family eventually. Right. You became part of this, oh goodness, what would you call it? Of the court, if you're in that was how you were seen.
So you were still a person.
You were still a person. You weren't dehumanized, although they might have looked down at you because you weren't from their group.
You were still a person.
You were still a person.
Whereas with the transatlantic slave trade, it is unique in the history of slavery, isn't it?
Because you are a chattel. You literally are a chattel.
To be caught, broken, raped.
To be mortgaged, raped, that's it, all that type of stuff. And that's what's, and you see that in the accounting of it, you know what I mean? If you think every one of these, a number, or no name, like I said, when people are buried and they're not given a name, or, it's very much just a thing to be bought and sold, to be used to your advantage and then discarded if needs be.
So if you were in West Africa and you'd become enslaved, would you be able to just break down for us what that experience would be like, what the process would be like? Where would you start to get kidnapped from?
Okay, well, it depends in the context. So if we're talking about during the slave trade period, usually, so when they were being to come to the Atlantic market, people from the coasts would go a little bit further inland. They'd buy it off someone who'd brought them from a little further inland, who might have bought them off someone who'd come from a little further inland, who might have gone to war with a particular village in order to get them.
Okay.
So by the time they got to the coast, they'd been bought or sold a few times to different people, each of whom are making a profit on the way. And then eventually they get to the coast, and then they're either sold to Europeans who are on the ships or in the forts. Right. And the forts were there and they'd be stored there. It's just terrible, isn't it? Until the ships came to purchase them, and then they would be sent off. Right. So because of the raiding, you can imagine how this like totally destabilized what had been very solid agricultural societies, you know.
Eat it from the inside out.
Exactly. And that went on. After it had been established, after 1 or 2 generations, you were just born into that system. So you knew no difference. Slavery was just a part of your everyday culture and society.
So I'm an arable farmer and I live with the possibility that somebody's going to enslave me.
Absolutely. And you'd had your mechanisms that would you use to deter that or to stop that as much as possible would be you do it to someone else before they could do it to you. Right. So that was kind of how it was, either slave or be enslaved type of thing. And that happened to a lot of societies. Then you had societies that sprang up because, you know, because they wanted to take advantage of the slave trade market. So in Dahomey, for example, you've seen the Black Panther film? I have this discussion with people about, you know, the Dora Milaje, the women warriors, they're based on the Dahomeyan warrior women. Right. So now everyone thinks that you'll see all the memes. Oh yeah, these strong black women, blah, blah, blah. They were established as slave raiders. They used to go out and raid to capture slaves for the king of Dahomey.
You're going to ruin some people's fantasies now,
this is what they were known to do, because Dahomey were one of the biggest suppliers. If you go to Benin today, the country of Benin, Dahomey, they have a this is why I think it's so two-faced, all this statue business. They have a statue of a man called Felix de Souza, a Portuguese man who settled in what is now Dahomey, and was one of the biggest, most prolific slave traders. They have a statue of him. His family are still considered to be of high status in Benin to this day. Thankfully, Benin as a nation has apologized for the role that they played in the slave trade. But these warrior women who everyone goes, you know, waxes lyrical about when they see them in Black Panther, that's who they were. These were slave raiders who decimated the Yoruba population of what is now, you know, Nigeria.
This is what I'm talking about with historical illiteracy. We can make utter clowns of ourselves, you know, just because we don't know.
We don't know.
And we can't take the time to find out. So
it's humility though, isn't it? Because it's having the humility to do that and take the time. Before I form an opinion, I'm going to get educated, you know, because, you know, everyone has we know the saying about opinions. Everyone has an opinion, but if your opinion isn't qualified, then it is just a load of crap. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's arrogance. I think, therefore, it is.
I can have opinions about physics and plumbing, and
do you know what I mean?
Fucking meaningless.
I mean, the arrogance of that. You know, so you can be the most well-read or the most articulate person, but if you're not willing to be humble enough to say, I'm going to take my time out to find out about this, then you do find people spouting off, you know, stuff like we've already discussed. You know, about you know. And no slaves came to Liverpool, or you know, it was white people who went into the interior of Africa and captured all these, you know, black people. So it's about humility.
Yeah. If I under those circumstances, if I've been enslaved, and I end up in a fort, what's going to happen to me next?
Okay. Well, it could be very, very bad. So
would I know that to be sold to the Europeans would be awful? Would I be begging to be sold to Africans instead?
Well, it's difficult to say, because depending on where you come from, there is narratives. So, for example, a lot of them were taken as kids, so they had not very little concept. Do you know what I mean? They, you know, or they've been told that the white man is a devil. Do you know what I mean? So if you get caught by him, it's like going
to hell.
The demons have got you. This was obviously one of the ways that you tell kids to stay away. You know, don't trust anyone that you don't know the face of. You know what I mean? Yeah. All these mechanisms people would use. So if you got to a fort, a lot of the times the women were raped by the people who lived in the fort. And so I've been to the forts in Ghana, and one of them is a central courtyard, and the women would be put in there, and the governor or whoever it may be, any of the, you know, lackeys, they'd choose which ones they wanted and then take them off and sexually exploit them. So that was one thing that would happen. Then, depending on when you got to the fort, you could be in the dungeon for 3 months.
Fucking hell.
And this is in tropical heat. You know, and I went in those dungeons, and I'm not one for all that spooky business, but there was a real feeling of some dark stuff has gone on in here over the years. And then you'd obviously end up on the ship. Then you'd have to survive up to another 3 months at sea, in terrible packed conditions where disease was rife.
Would it be laying down the whole time? Or?
Well, they'd get you up to exercise, but yeah, once you went down below decks, you were chained to a person next to you, so you couldn't engage in any type of active insurrection, which was always, there was always danger of insurrection at every stage.
Exercise, I'd be taken upstairs.
Yeah, to dance. They'd play music, or and try and make them dance, because obviously they wanted. If you three months of doing f all, you've wasted away by
atrophy,
the time. Yeah. So they'd get them up to dance, either with the whip or by playing music or whatever. So
that's fucking sinister.
Very, very, very.
So they come round, give you a bit of food, get you up. It's dancing time. Then you're locked back down, flat,
or on your bum. There was the decks were only say high, about 4 foot high, so you couldn't. Wasn't enough room to stand up. There's just barely enough room to sit down. And like you're saying, if you're trying to pack in as many people as possible, then they'd pack. It was said that a man in his coffin had more room than a slave in a slave ship.
And is it 2 to 3 months, or did you say 3 to 4 months?
Usually it was about 3 months. 3 month journey.
Below decks. Storm, whatever, dehydrated, dysentery, whatever. Then I arrive, and as you said, it's only 4% that went to North America. Everybody else is the Caribbean and Brazil.
The slaughterhouse.
And that would just be... Yeah. So for 96% of people, they're going to a very, very... most won't survive.
Premature death, most of them.
Premature death. So I'm off the ship. I go to the plantation. If it was the Caribbean, did you say that was sugar? Not
Mainly
cotton?
Mainly sugar. Cotton was grown there first,
yeah.
before, and a bit of tobacco.
Yeah.
But once sugar becomes the powerhouse of the British economy, then everyone's growing sugar.
Right.
That's why so many of those islands now are beautiful sandy. All that white sand rubbish.
Yeah.
They were lush tropical forests at one stage.
Oh, were they?
And that's okay. So all our beautiful George II furniture and stuff, Chippendale furniture, Waring and Gillow furniture. That's all a product of slavery as well, because all that timber, that tropical hardwood, they cleared it in order to make way so that they could lay it out. Think about massive deforestation like we see in Southeast Asia now.
Yeah.
That was done in the Caribbean in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah.
And the byproduct of clearing it for sugar was you got all this fantastic hardwood furniture.
Yes.
There's this hardwood that you can send back to be made into furniture by Chippendales. Right. All that Chippendale furniture is a legacy of British involvement in the slave economy.
So I'm off. The reason I laughed is because I know that with levers and what you're saying about the palm oil, it's in the soap, it's in the shower, it's in the food, it's in the cotton in your socks, it's in your foot, it's in everything. It touches everything. So once I've arrived, I would be assigned to, I take it, a local.
You'd be sold first, and there was lots of different ways you could be sold.
Okay.
So some of it was by scramble. So you'd put them all on the deck, people would stand down beneath, and then they go on, and everyone would run up and grab the slaves, because you can imagine what the slaves are going through, the enslaved. Someone just go up and grab them, check the teeth, check that they haven't been packed. Packed was like dysentery, so they'd bung up the backsides to stop them from,
Because you wouldn't want to slave with dysentery.
And they'd oil them up with the palm oil, make them all look glowing and stuff like that. And then you'd grab someone, and then you'd purchase them. That was by scramble. Then you'd just buy them in a general auction, on an auction block. You might buy cattle. You've seen how cattle auctions are.
Yeah.
These were the ways that people, you'd also have an agent who'd buy them. I want 6, and then you'd then sell them you'd then take them to your plantation, and that's your 6 slaves.
These would be white.
On the whole, yeah, but not all white. So there was mixed race planters as well, and a few black people, but on the whole, the vast majority
would be white.
The
people I've seen on the ship, all the people working on the ship, they'll all be white. No?
Motley crew. That's where the word comes from. So
really?
Slave ships were a motley. The crew of a slave ship was a motley crew.
Okay.
There was enslaved people worked on board slave ships. Men who were slaves in Liverpool. Went out on slave ships. The Hawk, slave ship, the Hawk. We've got the wage book.
Yeah.
And one of the entries in the wage book, Robert Williams, your wages have been forwarded to your master back in Liverpool. So he was a slave here in Liverpool who worked on slave ships. You had slaves who were slaves in West Africa who worked on board slave ships, and then you had lots of free blacks who worked on wage ships. You had some Asians sailed on slave ships. So it really was a motley crew.
Okay.
It could be made up of people from lots of different backgrounds. He had a black woman in Liverpool who was an interpreter,
Right.
who worked on board slave ships interpreting the language for the slaves, depending on where they went on the coast.
Yeah.
She'd get a commission. So many of these stories that you just would not believe, that sound so fantastical.
And it's such a broad human narrative, and it's so much richer than just white did to black and the end.
Yeah.
There's something, there's something so limiting about that. And you just feel it in your core. You go, it can't have been. And then when you hear the truth, it's hard to hear it, but it's almost like a physical somatic release. I go, oh, okay. I knew it couldn't be like that. Oof, okay. Almost at a cellular level, you feel, that's a relief, because that makes way more sense that it would be like that. So then being bought, go through to the plantation, and then I'm just housed in very basic conditions.
Very basic conditions, yeah. And then if you got through your season and everyone was happy because you're worth more now. If you wanted to sell you one because you were seasoned.
If you're seasoned, you're physically tough, but mentally completely broken.
Well, that's it, yeah.
How long is my seasoning?
It's usually, I think it's between 1 to 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it would be seen as an initiation, I take it? Like I'd be treating...
Well, it's, you'd have recalcitrant enslaved people.
Yeah.
You're like, fuck this. I'm a warrior. I'm not putting up with this shit. So you'd have to find a way of bringing them to book, like you had to do with a horse. Yeah. Some of them you couldn't, so they killed them because they realised, no, he's more trouble than he's worth.
Right.
Even if you put money into them.
Yeah.
So you'd execute them, or you'd take a foot, for example, so they could still work, but they couldn't run away. Like you saw it in Roots, because that's what happens to Kunta Kinte, don't you? You wouldn't want to damage your property, but people would do it if it was better to have a disabled enslaved person than someone who refused to work.
Or who could kill you in your sleep.
Who could kill you. And they always lived with that danger. There's always insurrections. So obviously you can imagine how brutal that society had to be, especially in societies where white people were in the minority, which is like the Caribbean. So that's why I said it was a slaughterhouse, And
that also would account, there's the guilt that would account for the brutality, and then there's fear.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because of your interest in psychology, I would recommend that you read The Diary of Thomas Thistlewood.
Okay.
Now, even when although it's just words and you can't imagine what went on, the things that he did to the enslaved people who he had relationships with, either his owner or, I don't think you could call them lover, but, sexual exploiter or whatever, they're just shocking to even to our 21st century sensibilities. And he writes about it. So I know this is ringing all kinds of bells for people who look at psychology. He records what he does.
This is a slave owner talking about what
Thomas
he does to
Thistlewood,
slaves, right?
talking about what he does to his property. And for me, like that, people talk about these type of narcissists who make lists and stuff like that.
Yeah, they hoard.
Yeah, and take trophies and all that. This is
he'd be a serial killer probably under other circumstances.
There you go. So he could engage in that type of stuff legally. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Because of the situation that he was in.
Right.
So that's and it's published now. The Diaries of Thomas Thistlewood.
Okay. Wow. Well, there's loads I wanna ask you more about. What time are we on now? We're bang on 8 o'clock. Would you be up for coming back and doing some more?
Yeah, no problem.
I'm gonna need a drink after this. Mate, that was,
as long as it isn't rum.
As long anything but fucking rum. Thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure.
Really appreciate
Pleasure,
that,
Rich.
and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, definitely, mate. No problem whatsoever.
I noticed you've got a GoFundMe running at the moment for a plaque that you want building in Liverpool.
Memorial. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? I'll share a link underneath the
certainly.
YouTube video.
So again, because I've had to deal with this issue about people not believing slaves came to Liverpool.
Right.
In light of when the statue was pulled down, as I said, I'm not a fan of pulling statues down. I'd rather see something built up. Mm-hmm. So we set up a GoFundMe to raise some money to erect a monument to the enslaved people who lived and died and were buried in Liverpool, but weren't given a marker, and some of them were buried even without their names. When you look at the parish records, they don't have a name. So we've got a GoFundMe page. It's called Liverpool Enslaved. Mm-hmm. We've already raised over £50,000. Yeah. So, obviously we've had a lot. All the donations have been small. Yeah. We've had 2 quite large donations, but apart from that, about £40,000 of that has been all quite small donations.
That's really heartening.
Yeah. So a lot of it's gotten a lot of love you know. And again, it's about adding something to the public realm, which will tell another important fact about Liverpool's important history.
Excellent. Okay, folks, we're going to do this again. If you've got questions, and I know you got comments, fucking hell, the comment section on this YouTube video is going to be on fire. But if you do have questions, or you see somebody else, please write your question. If you see somebody else's question you want it answering next time, vote it up, and I'll make a list, and I'll ask Laurence next time we do the interview. Apart from that, mate, thank you so much for this. It's really been enlightening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheers.